Well, last week we talked about a little faith. And this week we talk about crumbs of grace and courage. We get a lot of messages that keep us or seek to keep us in line. Keep your head down. Don't step out of line. Don't rock the boat. Follow the rules. My favorite growing up, mind your P's and Q's. This week and next, we are invited to learn from people in the Bible who display courage instead. They do not meekly color inside the lines, do what they are told, stay calm, and carry on. They take a stand, and as a result, they and others are blessed. So our text from Matthew appears to find Jesus with humanity on his last nerve. Depending on who you read, you can find every possible way of explaining that or explaining it away, explaining this interaction with the Canaanite woman, or explaining it away. She is none of the things that Peter was, right? Peter is a man, a Jew, an accepted member of Jesus's community. And she is not. She is the faithful other. And her story parallels that of Jesus's encounter with the centurion, you may remember, who came to Jesus asking for healing for a member of his household. One Canaanite, I'll be right. One commentator says that the Canaanite woman alters the timeline. And it reminds me of that moment in John's gospel when at a wedding, Jesus' mother says to him, "They have no wine." Do you remember that story? And he says, "Woman, what is that to me? My time has not yet come." And then he makes a lot of good wine, right? In our reading today, he compares the Canaanite woman to a dog. And people will say, well, he meant like a puppy. Okay, I feel like that's stretching. But whether you call someone a dog or you call them and their people puppies, it's not good. This is not a warm, fuzzy reaction that she gets. And the disciples just want Jesus to get her to go away. And depending on how you read the Greek, you can interpret that to mean, like, would you just do what she wants so that she will go? Or just make her go away. Because she is out of line. Right? Women in her day were supposed to be invisible. And a woman who was not a member of Jesus's community, coming him to ask for anything is already a problem. And doing it by shouting is another level of breaking the social norms. One commentator I read described her as an uppity woman. That sounded to me like a life goal. I went and I checked the definition of uppity. Is someone who is not complacent. Someone who is strongly self-assertive, an uppity woman, a woman who stepped out of line and whose faith impelled her to shout because there was a need for healing. She is, in Matthew's gospel, the first woman to speak. She is loud and demanding. She's not actually disrespectful. And she seems to understand who Jesus is in a way that is surprising, given that she comes from a different cultural viewpoint. She calls him Lord and also Son of David, which he's often called when he's being asked for healing. And she is undeterred when initially he does not acquiesce to her request. And Jesus labels her of great faith. Of great faith is the sort of label that you get after what you did worked. Right? Nobody is standing around during this encounter going, well, she's a person of great faith. Right? Can you hear them muttering? Like, who does she think she is? Why is she kicking up a fuss? If her daughter does need healing, there are forms you could fill out about that. You could speak to the proper authorities. Maybe get a male relative to show up. That would be better. I mean, she is really out of line. And we read these snippets, but we kind of get two today, right? Which is delightful. One of them is optional, but I did read it. We get this passage in Matthew with the Canaanite woman, with Jesus talking about dietary rules in the ancient world, right? So when the Gospels group stories together, the intention was that we would kind of hear them together. We do the Bible in much, much shorter snippets than we do, say, Netflix. But I actually think, like, the Bible was the Netflix of its day. At one point, these stories were the stories that people told. And Jesus has just made the point that following the rules about diet and eating is not what matters, right? The bigger picture of how our hearts are aligned, that's actually what matters. Or in other words, it isn't enough to just follow the rules. And we do these theology pub discussions. And one of my favorite snippets of a theology pub discussion so far has been on rule following. Which rules do we follow? Which rules do we think people should follow? Which rules don't we follow? And one of the things that I noticed is that some of our popular heroes are terrible rule followers. You probably have your own examples, but I think of James T. Kirk of the Starship Enterprise and the constant breaking of the Prime Directive. Like, if he doesn't break the Prime Directive, I'm not sure that was even an episode. Same with Harry Potter. And I think that is rooted in the fact that we know that it is possible for the rules to be wrong. There have been moments in time where what was legal was also morally repugnant, right? So we have to be discerning about what rules we follow, how we assess the rules we follow, but also, like, what is our focus? Because if we're focused on the details of following the rules, we can lose sight of the bigger picture, right? Which is the new covenant, right? Love God and love your neighbor. I can get lost, in my case, in why did you put that apostrophe there? It clearly does not need to be there. The rules of grammar are not that hard. We all have our things, right? Another friend of mine, it's how you park. Are you parked 2 feet from the curb? Could you not get a little closer? I mean, can you hear like that little bit of turning into a rant when we find ourselves in that space? We may be losing sight of loving each other. And we may be a little distracted from bigger issues, like the fact that there is a real need for healing. And we teach this to our children. There's a commandment about taking the Lord's name in vain. And my children were very disturbed at a certain point in their elementary school years because we had friends and acquaintances who would do that all the time, basically, right? Oh, good Lord. Oh, good Lord. For this was their understanding of what that meant, right? Somebody saying, oh my God, when they actually are not praying. And we had to have a conversation because that commandment, which gets turned into this minutia of language, and are you swearing? Are you using language that you shouldn't use? Is really about how we treat other people in God's name. Right? And we know that that also happens in our world a lot. That religion becomes a means of inflicting harm, or a way of sitting up on our high horse, which again is not loving. Right? Same thing with swear words, four-letter words. Kate Bowler, who wrote a great book, Everything Happens for a Reason. It's her experience with being diagnosed with serious cancer. And she says, actually, some things in life merit strong language. Right? Some situations, cancer, for example, can merit strong language. And if we become frustrated or judgmental with hurting people because they have failed decorum, then obviously we're missing something important. Right? When we say, I know you're unhappy, but I need you to express that in a more polite manner. We start this really young, right? Children come unglued and we're annoyed that they had a temper tantrum. As opposed to being able to see how deeply uncomfortable they had to get before they came unglued. If we do this a little better, it is grace to other people and also grace to ourselves, right? To have compassion instead of worrying about the details. And biblically, this is rock solid, right? So the Canaanite woman is allowed to negotiate with Jesus. She's allowed to break social mores and to shout, and he can hear her, right? She doesn't have to go through proper channels. He is able to withstand someone questioning his answer in full view of everybody who's going to write this down for us later. And in fact, just following the rules is what gets people called a hypocrite by Jesus. And our social constructs, right, even above and beyond our laws about how you do things and how you show up for church, having it all together and being properly dressed, for example. Those things we can set aside in favor of looking after each other well. Right? My generation, and I think even more so before my generation, that emphasis on being polite, that can get in the way of being authentically in community and looking after each other well. In particular, if you have young women and girls in your lives, they need to know that being safe is much more important than being polite. Right? We call out things that make us feel unsafe, even if it might be momentarily uncomfortable. And it's funny because I am grown and I would think that I would have a grip on all of this, but I was at a social event the other day and there was someone sitting on a front porch, smoking, wearing an oxygen. Thank you. Right? If anybody doesn't know, typically if you have oxygen in your house, you have big placards saying no sparks, no smoking, no flame, because oxygen is incredibly flammable. This is very dangerous. And I did say something because I have just enough background in healthcare to know what it actually looks like when this goes very wrong. But it was very uncomfortable to say to this gentleman, you might want to take your oxygen off if you're going to have a cigarette. Like that goes really badly, really quickly. So yeah, we have to be thinking about being willing to get outside our comfort zone, because our comfort zone is kind of the way things are, and also it's not real curious about how things could be better, right? Because we're a little resistant to change. When you move into a house, have you noticed that if you live with something a certain way for 6 months, you can live with it forever? Right? Things just kind of become invisible. So in the Bible, we get these models of courage, right? The Canaanite woman, the woman at the well. Even like if you think about Moses or Abraham negotiating with God, there are moments where they say, "But really, are you really going to do that thing?" And God responds and is able to hear that. This week marked the feast day of Jonathan Daniels. If you followed Lent Madness, you know that he won the Golden Halo this year. And his reading for feast day one of them was taken from Amos, who is, I think, possibly my favorite prophet of the written prophets. And Amos says, I despise your festivals. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. You get the idea. Jonathan Daniels became involved as a seminarian in the civil rights movement. Showed up for protests after Martin Luther King Jr. had asked for white clergy to be paying attention. Ended up being jailed. ended up getting permission to stay as opposed to just parachuting in and then leaving. And ultimately ended up being shot because he pushed somebody out of the way of a shotgun blast, right, as they were trying to integrate the South. He was courageous in his understanding that how we live has to be about taking care of other people. That is gospel. And the end of that quote from Amos in that particular reading is, "But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." Amen.